I'm Graham Smith, I'm the Chief Executive of the Republic. Do what it says on the tin, we campaign for the abolition of the monarchy. And it's quite a relevant issue at the moment, to my mind, because it's not just about the Queen and about the palace and the princes. It's about politics, and it's been very big in the news over the last few weeks about how our politics needs to change. Almost everybody now agrees that it needs to change, or at least is saying that it needs to change one way or another. Since what's been going on in the run-up to the referendum and the referendum itself in Scotland. Now, what's not really being discussed in any great depth is the actual system in Westminster itself, and that's the main nub of the problem. That is where the real reform has to happen. People are talking about devolution in England and more powers going to Parliament in Scotland, but it's the powers that exist in Westminster and the manner in which they are exercised and the lack of scrutiny and the lack of accountability, which are really quite fundamental to the problems of our politics, and just the fundamental lack of democracy. I mean, if you look at our Westminster institutions, look at the three parts of Parliament, which are the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the Monarchy. Only one of those three parts is elected. And quite frankly, that part that is elected, once elected, is fairly weak in terms of its relationship to the government and the executive. So, what does the monarchy have to do with that? Well, it's got quite a lot to do with that, and I'm going to sort of run through a few reasons why we think the monarchy is a bad thing, and why we think a republic is the alternative. And in those reasons, you will see that it does actually come back quite significantly to the issue of power and politics. Now, I think what was so exciting, I'm English, I live in England, but watching Scotland go through this extraordinary experience of really, someone summed it up a few weeks ago, saying that on that day, on the 18th, just for those few precious hours, the people of Scotland are going to have all the power they could ever hope to have in their hands. They're going to be sovereign citizens, absolutely able to determine the future of their country. And that's quite an exciting moment, and I think there was so much sort of weighing on that decision that's why people were so moved to register to vote and then to go out and vote. And they had record turnout, but also record engagement, huge amounts of enthusiasm. The very first 16, 17-year-olds ever in a national election in Britain voting. And to me, as a Democrat and as a reformer, that was hugely exciting to watch that happen. And I think that it kind of proved that two things. Firstly, the whole idea of apathy is a bit of a myth. It's not people that are apathetic, they care deeply. It's just they don't see the general elections, the sort of two-party fights that we have between Tory and Labour, they don't see that really makes a lot of difference to their lives, and what they put on the ballot paper doesn't necessarily change the outcomes in the subsequent Parliament. And I think the other thing that it shows is that we do, as a country, care and believe in democracy, and this is one of the fundamental points. We do believe in democracy. Sometimes people question it or doubt it. I think the reason why they do that is because they've only really experienced British democracy. British democracy is really not very good, and it's not particularly democratic. But we do believe in it, and that's one of the fundamental points against the monarchy, is that in principle it is absolutely undemocratic and anti-democratic. It stands absolutely foursquare against the democratic principles that we actually do quite obviously hold and cherish and hold dear. And monarchists can't really argue that point. You can't say, oh no, it is democratic. No, it's not. Some of them say, oh well, a majority like it, therefore it's democratic. That's not democracy. Democracy is the means by which people can actually have their power and exercise it. It isn't something which is simply popular in the opinion polls. So principle is the number one argument for getting rid of the monarchy, and it's quite a fundamental point which, to my mind, is unanswerable to the monarchists. Another point, which is quite important in my mind, is the palace itself, the royal household, the princes, the queen, and all the others that inhabit that strange entity called the monarchy. That is a problem itself. It's not an institution that functions well. It's not an institution that functions according to modern standards of public life. It's not an institution that is open to proper scrutiny. It certainly isn't open to any kind of accountability. And it is an institution that exploits its position routinely, which uses its access to government ministers to pursue its own interests, and which, famously takes liberties when it comes to public money. So, it's not an institution which we ought to feel proud of, because it's an institution that is essentially self-serving. Its number one mission is to protect itself and preserve itself for the next generation. That is all it's there to do. It certainly isn't there to serve the interests of the people. And if you look at the behaviour of the royals, which is so often excused by all and sundry, either because people don't want to make a fuss, or because they genuinely believe that these people have some kind of birthright to the British state and to the British Treasury. But if you look at the behaviour, it is quite frankly appalling. The money is not, the cost of the monarchy is not a reason for getting rid of it. But it is a symptom of an institution that is completely unaccountable. So, for example, if you look at the ease with which someone like Charles would use public money to go on a 4-day holiday within the UK. I mean, a couple of years ago, it's something like £30,000 for a 4-day trip to Scotland. That's a lot of money. A lot of people are losing their public sector jobs where they would get £30,000 across the whole year if they're lucky. And this guy just takes £30,000 of our taxpayers' money and spends it on one 4-day trip. And that's a kind of a routine occurrence. We don't know all of these occurrences because under FOI rules, and under the rules governing the way they publish royal accounts, they won't tell us any individual travel bill under £10,000. Now, I know that for £10,000 I can go to Australia and back several times. So that's quite a lot of travel, which they're not telling us about. And of course, there's the accommodation, the palaces, the grace and favour apartments for royals that you've never heard of, the enormous expense of security, which is estimated at around £100 million. There's the duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster, which belong to us, whereas all of the money goes to them, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, again, as I said, we estimate that it's something like £300 million every year to cost the taxpayer. They claim it's £36 million a year. Now, that to me says something about their wish to hide their costs, their desire to try and pretend that they are cheap or even almost free to come up with this 56p per person per year figure. And I was on Sky News in July, when it was, when the last report came out, and the reporter down the camera said to me, down the earpiece, said, all our viewers are phoning in saying, this is really good value for money. And I said, well, that's because you spent the whole morning telling them it was 56p per person. You don't do that. You actually are honest and open about what's actually costing the taxpayer. People might think twice. So again, it's not the cost, it's the fact that the palace chooses to hide the true costs and then spin its way out of that kind of trouble, which says it speaks volumes for the kind of institution that we're talking about. It's an institution that wants to have everything its own way and doesn't want the sort of scrutiny and accountability that other organisations have to face. They also, routinely access ministers for, defend their ear over all sorts of things. Now, again, famously, Charles is the one that's routinely in the papers for writing memos to government ministers. He has, private, quiet, secret meetings with ministers, secret in the sense that you're never going to know what to send them. And there's been a lot of scandal over the last few years about corporate lobbying, the power of the rich and the powerful to directly access ministers and to bend their ear and to persuade them to change government policy for their benefit rather than for the public benefit. When it's big business, when it's Rupert Murdoch, people get up in arms. When it's Charles, it's like, well, let's just make excuses. And it's not good enough. So Charles shouldn't be allowed to essentially demand access to a government minister and then be able to seek to persuade to change their mind on public policy. And if he does try and do that, we need to know about it. And there's a reason why we don't know about it, which I'll come back to in a moment. But he does do this, and we know he does it, and he does it, and it's not only him that does it. We're fairly certain that others will try and do it as well. And if you don't believe it, then I would say, well, why wouldn't they try and do it? Who wouldn't try and do that if you were in a position where you can spend your life, you know, whatever you do, anything like that, you can spend your life sort of your own pursuits and interests, and also you have all of the staff and advisors, press people and so on, and you're told, you know what, if you want to influence the government, just phone them up, just write them a letter, you can have a direct meeting with a minister, and no one's ever going to know what you said to them. Of course you would. You'd be superhuman to resist that temptation. Now the problem with Charles and the Queen is that they have real leverage, because they have something called Queen's and Prince's consent, which simply means that any new law that goes through Parliament which affects their private interests has to go to them for consent before it can proceed to its final stage. Now that's not a technicality, that's not a formality. That's different to royal assent, which is the process by which the Queen rubber stamps a new law or a new act of Parliament into law. This is Queen's and Prince's consent, and it is a fact that if a piece of legislation affects Charles's private interests, it has to go to Charles, and if he just sits on it and doesn't respond, it cannot finish its passage through Parliament. Now, it's very unlikely that he's ever actually stopped a piece of legislation, but the problem is that the civil service know that there is that opportunity for him to cause difficulties for the government, and so they will make sure that legislation is written in his favour as and when it goes through, which is why, as we've been looking through pieces of legislation where consent is required, an awful lot of it gives privileged treatment to the Duchy of Cornwall. So there's no surprise that that happens, because people, civil servants know that you can actually cause trouble in the legislative process. They don't make sure that he's looked after along the way. Now that, to me, is an absolute scandal in our British democratic system. The other sort of scandalous part of that is that with the Queen's consent, the government can use that by instructing the Queen to refuse consent to kill off private members' bills that they don't like. And that was done a few times over the last 15 years. These particular bills were put out in a report in The Guardian. I think the one that springs to mind was to do with the war powers, the right of Parliament to vote on going to war. And I think it was Tam Dial who introduced this, and then it fell because it didn't receive Queen's consent on the advice of the government. So that wasn't the Queen doing, that was the government using this ancient right to kill off a piece of legislation. So the palace is a problem in itself. It is, I don't think it's stretching to say it's corrupt. It is, misusing and abusing public position for personal and private gain. And they will use, as I said, they will use it for pushing their own agenda. So Charles will push homeopathy or the environment or whatever, but also for pushing their own interests. So when they secured changes to the royal funding a couple of years ago under this government, that was a result of royal lobbying, which is completely beyond any kind of scrutiny. And around 2010, all three parties started in the tail end of the Labour government and was completed in the first few months of this government. All three parties agreed to change the Freedom of Information Act so that there was an absolute exemption for communications between Charles and the Queen and other senior members of the royal household and public bodies, which basically meant it just absolutely tightened up. So have you heard about the Guardian legal challenge to try and get letters that Charles wrote to ministers, so that's been dragging on for about 7 years now, 8 years maybe. Yeah, they're going back to the court again in November, but that challenge now, that request now, the Guardian put in a new request for those letters, it would fall the first letter because since the current challenge began, they changed the law to make the exemption absolute, so they've got absolutely no chance of knowing what was going to be said to ministers by Charles. So as I said, we need, and this is quite an important point, because they claim that the royals are neutral and impartial, above politics and non-political. And Charles clearly isn't above politics and non-political. He's clearly a very political figure. And when the Guardian was winning one of his many court cases against the government to have these letters released, the courts were quite clear. They said that there is a distinction between Charles's right as heir to the throne, which is an absurd right anyway, but it does exist in the Constitution. There's a difference between his right as heir to the throne to be advised and progress his government business on one hand, and Charles's lobbying of ministers on the other. And they made it quite clear that Charles does have to be politically neutral, and therefore it's in the public interest to know that he is actually being politically neutral. The government's response, the Attorney General government vetoed that court decision on the grounds that if the public saw the letters, it would damage Charles's political neutrality. In other words, it's better to keep them secret and pretend he's neutral than publish them and know that he's not. Now that's an absurd position to find yourself in a modern democratic society. And that comes to the kind of the nub of the point with the whole issue of secrecy, is that the monarchy needs secrecy in order to survive. It cannot survive in the open light of day. Because if you know what it's doing, and you don't like it, there's no mechanism to get rid of them and change the people in the positions. And any system whereby there's no mechanism to change will snap. And that's the beauty of democracy, is it's flexible. When you don't like the people, there is a mechanism, however imperfect, to get rid of them. And that's what happened in the last election, it may be what happens in the next election, and that's why democracy is such a powerful force, because you give people the chance to say, actually, you're no good, we're going to replace you. If the monarchy is in that position of being open and subject to scrutiny, and people don't like what the Queen's doing, or don't like what Charles is doing, you would just find the pressure and the scandals becoming unbearable until the entire institution breaks. So as I say, principle is fundamental, and the palace itself is fundamentally flawed. And the last point comes back now to where I started on the issue of politics. Because it's not just about the power of the Queen and Charles to interfere. It's not just about the theoretical idea that's in principle wrong. It actually affects the way in which our government functions. The Prime Minister has enormous amounts of power given to him by the Crown. These are powers traditionally exercised by the Queen, and still exercised by the Queen, but on the advice of the Prime Minister. Now, some of these have started to be whittled away. So, for example, in the news today, they're talking about whether or not to start bombing parts of Iraq and Syria. Now, was it last year, I think it was, when they wanted to bomb Syria? Cameron went to the Commons voted no, and Cameron respected that vote. And in just like that, we changed the British Constitution. So now, and this is kind of that is now being embedded in this week by the fact that Cameron wants to go back to the Commons for another vote before he sends fighter bombers back to the Middle East. So all of a sudden the Constitution's been altered, so Parliament does have this right to vote on military action, which is quite an extraordinary constitutional reform. But that power to send troops and declare war is a crown power, which the government does still have. And even though we've established this new convention over the last 18 months, it's quite possible for the government to turn around and say, well, to be honest with you, we've still got that power and we're still going to go ahead and wage war with the Parliament, without a vote in Parliament. They have enormous amounts of power of patronage, the power to appoint, the power to award and to give honours, which is quite a considerable power, because if the government minister or the Prime Minister says to a government minister or to a backbencher, if you just keep quiet, then there'll be a knighthood in it for you, or we'll make you the ambassador to Washington or something. That gives you an enormous amounts of leverage and personal authority. And there's also the Privy Council, which most people don't know anything about. I think the Privy Council is able to make law without any recourse to Parliament. And that's quite an extraordinary thing. This is an area which we're still looking into to try and find out exactly what laws are being made from one week to the next. But they do make laws. They did this with the Chagos Islanders. Have you heard of the Chagos Islanders? Certainly some of you might have. These are people in the Indian Ocean who were expelled from their homes by the British government so that the US could build a base on their island. They spent years and years and years fighting for the right to get back to their home. And it looked like the courts were going to rule in the islanders' favour. So our government went down to Buckingham Palace, stood in a little semicircle, formed the Privy Council, and changed the law. So that court case was no longer going to succeed. Now, it's that kind of, and again, famously, Margaret Thatcher took away the right of people in GCHQ to be members of the trade union. Tony Blair gave it back to, returned that right to them. Both of them did it by sending their ministers down to Buckingham Palace, standing in a semicircle, it's the Privy Council, and changing the law. So, and this law has the force of primary legislation. Any primary legislation that goes through Parliament has to be declared on the floor of the House that it's compatible with the Human Rights Act. That doesn't have to happen if you pass the law through the Privy Council. So there's quite a lot of actual political power going on in Westminster which derives from the Crown. And in that sense, the monarchy isn't really there for any other reason than to protect that power structure. Because if you try and change it, and try and challenge it, people start talking about the Queen, Her Majesty, you can't affect Her Majesty's constitutional position, yada, yada, yada. And it's used as an excuse to say, no, we can't change that power structure. That would be wrong. So yeah, it does actually become a serious part of the political structure. And in Britain, we have, as I said, we've got these three parts of the national constitution, or the four parts that you have to separate out of the government. So you've got the government, which is sort of indirectly elected. You've got the House of Commons, which is elected and quite weak. You've got the House of Lords, which is unelected and quite weak. And you've got the monarch, who is unelected and has a slightly odd and secretive role. But in terms of actual political power, all the power is in Downing Street. I say all the power, it depends enormously on the Prime Minister, it depends on political circumstances, it depends on the majority that they've got, and so on and so forth. Of course, our MPs at the moment, we've got the ability to thwart David Cameron, if they so choose, and they're in a coalition, so it's a little bit more difficult. But if you go back to Tony Blair, we had huge majorities. The Commons pretty much just did what he asked. And there were occasional rebellions and so on. But on the whole, routinely, one week to the next, the Commons was there to go yes to everything that the government wanted to do. And that makes a mockery of voting to turn up to the polling booths and elect an MP rather than just directly electing a government. And the reason why he's got that power is the power of the Crown. The enormous power that he has over the legislative process, the power of patronage that I mentioned before, which allows him to appoint huge numbers of people to the government ranks, and obviously offer gongs and so on. It's also the power, the honour system, for example, and the power to appoint people to the Lords, it all comes from the Crown, and it is quite blatantly corrupt. a lot of people in the Lords. There was a Lib Dem MP that said, he spoke at one of our events, he said there's a joke going around Westminster, how do you address a Labour Party donor? The Lord. Because almost all Labour Party donors who've given more than £1 million are now sitting in the House of Lords. And that's a disgraceful fact. Now, it's not just the Labour Party, of course. It's, almost certainly the Tory Party is the same, and I suspect the same with the Lib Dems as well. I gave evidence on the honours system, and there was one glaring example where there was a multi-millionaire who'd given large amounts of money to the Tory Party and had given large amounts of money to the English National Opera. And then he got knighted. And I said, well, quite obviously, if you ask anybody in the street, why did he get that knighthood? It's not the English National Opera. It's the large amounts of money he gave to the Tory Party. And that happens routinely and all the time. And again, that is power derived from the crown. And it's very difficult to get rid of that power because people immediately start jumping up and down about, oh, you're attacking Her Majesty and you want to get rid of the monarchy. And so ultimately, what you have to do if you want to change the power structure is you just have to go for the jugular. But you have to go and say, yes, I do want to get rid of the monarchy. Yes, we do need to be democratic right through the core of our system. No excuses, no faffing about and sort of trying to tinker here and there. You just have to say, right, this doesn't work. We need a democratic system. It's wrong in principle. You see the palace doesn't function properly, and it's clearly not working in a modern and sophisticated way in terms of our politics and democratic process. So that's broadly the reason why I want to get rid of the monarchy. It's fairly straightforward. The alternative is also fairly straightforward. Our nearest neighbour, the Republic of Ireland, does it pretty well. They came out of, they gained their independence in a way that was a little bit more fraught than it would have been had Scotland voted yes. And yet they managed to put together a constitution which is quite simple, it's very democratic, and in terms of their head of state, all citizens of Ireland get to come together and elect one of their own to be their president. And that president doesn't own the country. Very much like our Queen, that president sits at the top as a figurehead, but also has certain powers, reserved powers, constitutional powers, should something go wrong. They have a very simple constitution, and there are limits to what Parliament is allowed to do. So if Parliament passes a law which the President believes is unconstitutional, the President can say, well, actually, I don't think that's allowed. It can then go to arbitration with the Constitutional Court. It's a very simple and elegant system, and it works. And it's happened about 7 times since the Constitution came into force. And sometimes the court said the President's right, sometimes Parliament's right. It's just that extra check, that extra balance against the power of the government and the Parliament. The rest of the time, the President just simply represents the Irish people in Ireland and the wider Irish diaspora around the world. And they've had really good presidents. I mean, they're not necessarily the most famous people in the world, but I think Michael D. Higgins is their current president. He's quite an inspirational figure. He's been around a long time. He has been a politician, but not with one of the main parties. He was Labour, which is one of the small parties in Ireland. I saw a photo of him a little while ago. Well, 2 photos I saw of him actually. One of them was him sitting on a BMX in a BMX park, so he's visiting some kind of scheme, and just sort of, just being a normal person with other normal people in a way that you cannot ever imagine a member of the royal family doing. And another one which became quite famous in Ireland not that long ago. Someone caught a photo of him just standing there behind another person waiting to use a cash machine. And again, you just would never imagine a member of the royal family doing that. And it is a simple point, but the point is you get to choose someone who is one of us to represent us. In a very genuine sense, they are another fellow citizen who understands the lives that we lead. I think that's quite powerful. Because I think that we, not that long ago we celebrated, or were told to celebrate, 60 years of one head of state. And to my mind, if one person is in public office for 60 years, there's something seriously wrong. whether that's elected head of state or an unelected one. But then we reflected on what did that 60 years give us? It was a huge lost opportunity. Can you imagine over that 60 years how many great public figures, leaders, politicians, all those great speeches, all those great political moments, and we've had this one silent monarch. No one can remember a single thing that she's ever said, or any moment of tragedy or triumph when she has stood up and spoken for the nation. And even last week, on Friday, the day after we just about managed to save the Union, her Union, she couldn't even come on TV and speak eloquently and intelligently, both to the Unionists and the Independents side of that argument. She simply had someone else write a statement which was published, and obviously reported as, oh, the Queen has said this, the Queen has said that. And she couldn't even get to sit down in front of a camera and actually make an address, which you might expect a head of state to do, given that we had this hugely fraught couple of weeks when a lot of people were very concerned that the Union was going to break in half, and a lot of people were very excited about the prospect of the Union breaking in half, and then it didn't happen. And that needs some kind of leadership that isn't the political leader of one side of that argument. It needs a head of state who can actually speak to and for the nation. And we don't have that head of state. We have essentially an empty chair filled by someone who is more concerned about protecting their own interests and their own position and serving the interests of the nation. So as I say, the Republic of Ireland, we're not talking about copying that, but we're talking about sort of looking to that for inspiration, taking what we've got now, British democracy, and turning it into a genuinely democratic British republic. So I hope that's worth the wait. Thank you very much for listening. And I don't know whether we're going to go straight to questions or whether you...
Are you happy fielding them?
Right?
Are you happy just answering them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any questions or points or arguments? Anyone disagree with? You want to sleep, I don't know where. Anyone? Yes.
Yeah, from what you've just said, you clearly don't think the present Queen is a good Queen indeed. A lot of people say, oh yeah, we'll get rid of the monarchy, but she's been a good Queen. So you disagree with that theory?
I absolutely, yeah. I think it's dreadful to say. I really genuinely do, and I think also we need to get used to saying that as well. And I think the problem is that a lot of people have grown up being told that that's the way to think about it and talk about it. But also, people judge her by her own standards. When they say, oh, she's been a good monarch, it's because the only monarch they know is her, and she's been good in her. It doesn't make sense. If we actually look to other heads of state, as I was saying before about other inspirational figures, and judge her by those standards, she falls very, very short. And the other one, which really, I mean, sometimes it winds me up a little bit, because I was watching the opening ceremony of the Olympics, and she looked for all the world like she didn't want to be there. And I don't know whether anybody else watched it, but there was this huge, you've got all the teams coming in, and because we were the host team, we were the last one. And when our team, Team GB, came in, the whole place was erupted. And then the camera cut to the Queen, and she was sitting there going, well, that's looking bored. And of course, Hugh Edwards, who was narrating, he just like, oh, look, there's the Queen, obviously proud. It's like, well, obviously not, and you would imagine someone like Michael Higgins jumping up and cheering along with everyone else.
Do you think there is any benefit of having the Queen as a figurehead for the national identity, for representing the United Kingdom on a global scale?
No.
None at all.
No, only simply because we can do so much better. I mean, if we're talking about national identity, I think that what the royal family and what the Queen and Monarchy do is kind of skew that national identity in a particular way, which I don't think necessarily reflects relevance. In the course of my job, I talk to a lot of overseas journalists, and quite a lot of them think that we're a little bit mad for having this weird system, including, I mean, I particularly remember talking to Polish and Brazilian journalists whose countries have become democratic in much more recent years, and particularly Poland, I think, is sort of leapfrogged over us in terms of how democratic their constitution. And they wonder why we still put up with this thing. But also other people, like particularly Americans, I think, have this slightly patronising view of us, being quaint little England, where we still obsess about the royal family. I don't think it's a bit sad, because what we are actually is this really modern, vibrant, dynamic society which has got so much more to offer. And I think that if we had someone that represented the real Britain rather than the sort of the chocolate box Britain, that would be much more powerful. Anyone else?
The idea of a written constitution you touched upon before you came to our. Do you, in terms of a constitution, do you feel that we talk about how we've seen evidence of how the monarchy inhibits certain progressive policies or bills in Parliament? Do you think a written constitution would have the same issues? Would that also inhibit progress in the same way that the monarchy does as well?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the monarchy inhibits progressive legislation. I think that they can get in the way of the legislative process as long as the legislation affects their interests. And it wouldn't necessarily stop the legislation going through, it would simply make it exempt for them. But in terms of the written constitution, no, I don't think, a written constitution doesn't have to be overly prescriptive. Which is why I would tend to look to more modern constitutions than going further back to, say, the US Constitution, which was written in 2 centuries ago, and is probably too prescriptive in certain ways. But then again, it's also worth remembering that the US Constitution can be changed, as can the Irish Constitution. And the power of the written Constitution is that it's very clear what it is, what it says, what it allows your politicians to do and not do, and it also should be clear how you can change it if you want to change. So when people argue, the famous one is America, where they say, they've got this right to bear arms, and that's causing all sorts of problems. It's not the US Constitution that causes that problem, it's US politics and US culture that causes that problem. It's the fact that they want to have that right, and they don't want to change their constitution. But they can change it if they wish to. And they have done. They changed their constitution about 17 times since the original first 10 amendments. So there's 27 amendments now. So there's 17 over 200 years. It's quite a lot of change. I think it's even more frequent in Ireland as well. Yeah, it'd be fairly
that many at the time. I lived in Ireland from 98 to last year.
Yeah.
And we had a referendum. Well, that was the other thing, of course. Everybody votes in the referendum.
Yeah.
Everybody who's able to vote votes in the referendum to change the constitution.
Yeah.
I think we changed the constitution 5 times, 6 times.
Yeah, I think it's since the Commonwealth
Well, that's
Constitution came in, I think it's changed a few more times. It's been quite frequent. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with changing constitutions. I think what happened, to my mind, my reaction to Scotland was to say, well, that kind of shows it's okay. We can do this, and we don't all suddenly, the sky doesn't make it for us, and we survive it. And it's quite engaging to actually allow people to decide for themselves what sort of country we're going to be. And I think that's quite powerful. I think a lot of people have always been fearful of having referenda and having written constitutions and making these changes because they don't really trust the people to make a sensible decision. And I think that mistrust is grossly misplaced, and I think that Scotland has helped to do that.
We also advocate for the removal of the House of Lords, yes, due to its undemocratic.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, fully elected upper house. It is. A very large number of them are ex-MPs or academics. This idea that there's sort of experts in there, there's very few of them and they don't really turn up very much. But yeah, we still have 92 hereditary peers, which is a nonsense. And ironically, there are hereditary peers who are the only peers to have been elected to the House of Lords, which is absurd. Because there has to be 92 of them, and if one of them dies, the other 91 of them then elect some other hereditary lord back into the House. So, the hereditary lords are the only elected lords, which is mad. But, and then of course we still have about 25 bishops of the Church of England. Clerics in the state parliament, something you share with around, so it's not very different. So yeah, we get rid of all that.
So we still have a two-house system
then? Yeah. I mean, some people argue for one house. I think there's a role to play. I think that the more you dilute power and don't make sure that it's not all in the hands of one body or one person, the better. I think that having that two-house system works in Australia. I think it works quite well in Australia.
But counterpoint, it also doesn't particularly work in the US, where you get a situation where one party controls one house and another party controls the other, two fight each other and nothing gets done. Is that not an inherent problem with having two elected houses?
Well, I think the US has all sorts of inherent problems that cause that particular issue, and I think that they do still manage to govern themselves, and they are still the largest economy and really powerful and still manage to pass laws and things. So yes, sometimes it gets bogged down, causes problems, but I think the real point is that if those that we've elected don't agree to something, then it probably shouldn't happen. And that's kind of the fundamental principle underlying that. You shouldn't, and yes, you can balance the power more in favour of one than the other. In the United States, there's quite an even balance of power, so both of them can stop things going through. In Australia, there's a fairly even balance of power as well. The upper house can stop legislation going through. And certainly it was the case, I can't remember whether it still is. They used to be able to stop budgets as well, which is what put them down in 75. And yet they don't have the same problem. So I think it's as much to do with the culture of American politics compared to the Westminster culture. And also they have a division of the head of government from both houses, which we would recommend here. We would say we'll keep the Prime Minister in the lower house and have that parliamentary system, which I think also creates a slightly different dynamic. But I think that there's quite a lot of power in saying that you have to argue your case for legislation rather than simply say, right, this is the legislation you want, you now go and agree it. I think that's quite a powerful point.
One of the stuff you mentioned earlier was about Charles having meetings with members of Parliament and things. You also pointed out that Bradlaugh has done it as well.
Yeah.
So surely that shows that our politicians aren't above corruption, and even if we remove the monarchy, they're still going to be influenced by other people. So how would that work in?
There's a much wider line about lobbying, which is that it needs to be transparent. So Murdoch goes and spends the weekend with the Prime Minister, we have a right to know that. And there's arguments as to how much we have a right to know about that, and we certainly need to know that that kind of contact is happening. So for example, so we can, at the very least, be able to measure the actions of the government against the interests of the people lobbying. And then we can make judgments as to whether inappropriate influence comes into play. The problem with Charles is that there's no way that we can know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't know any kind of, don't have any sense of what sort of influence is actually succeeding or being intended. And if we did know, as I said before, if we did know and didn't like it, there's not a lot we can do about it either. There's too much deference, but also there's no mechanism to get rid of Charles. And so, it creates a whole other layer of problems that you wouldn't have with this private company or something like that. So, yeah, the whole lobbying thing is a problem. But we need to apply the same standards in fixing that problem to corporations and Charles. And it's difficult to do that whilst Charles is part of the machinery.
I suppose, leading on from that, we also have that issue where the monarchy isn't just the Queen. There's the whole palace arrangement, and that would be changed under a movement towards a republic. Where you've got the influence of Charles, who's the heir to the throne at the moment. But you've also got the others, like the Duke of York, for instance, and people like that.
Yeah, that's the family.
Who also have influence over the ministers and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Prince Andrew is, is a case in point, who doesn't just have access and influence, but he's had some official position for quite a long time, where he goes around representing the government as a trade ambassador. Now, a couple of years ago, they said they'd taken that title away from him, but it turns out that they just took the title away from him and didn't take the job away from him. And he's also, he's a very close friend, has communication with the royal, so very close friends with very unsavoury people that are usually resident in Middle Eastern, North African or Central Asian dictatorships. And so while trying to represent the British interests, they're also having a word in the ear of people in the interests of these unsavoury characters. So, so yeah, all of that would be swept aside, and they would be private citizens and have to make their own way in the world. Just a few £1 million in the pocket.
Do you have any ideas why I think republicanism has generally been such a marginal political movement? I don't get this overwhelming sense of the popularity of the monarchy, and I remember times when the monarchy has been massively unpopular, and it nearly died in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And in more recent times, I can think of like Edward VII as a monarch who helped make the monarch more accessible and likeable, and our present monarch, there's a big public relations machinery that goes on. But I don't feel it is I don't get the impression that most people have a lot of time for the monarchy.
No, you're right. And the main reason why, there's all sorts of historical, I think, reasons that if you put it into context, you understand why it hasn't become a major force. The main reason why it hasn't become a major issue is because people haven't made it one. Republicans have been they just haven't risen to the challenge of doing the work that's needed to make it an issue. A lot of issues become an issue because people go out there and make it happen. Whether it's rights movements, whether it's the suffragettes or gay rights or the environmental movement or whatever. People have gone out and done it, and that's what we're now trying to do. We haven't been trying to do it for that long, and it's starting to, we're doing a lot better now than we were 5 years ago, helped enormously by the wedding and the Jubilee and the Royal Birth. But historically, I think, there's deliberate attempts by the palace to kind of rebrand, if you like. Then, of course, there's the war and the young queen. I think that all had an impact. And I think it took quite a while for it to become okay again to be critical of the royals after that. And by that time, people that were Republican were quite reluctant to really do anything about it. There is also a genuine sense, even amongst some Republicans, it is just a matter of principle and it doesn't have any sort of further-reaching impact. It's not a political thing. I think people in the Labour tradition aren't necessarily wedded to issues of constitutional reform, so they don't necessarily see it in that sense. It's just a kind of a badge of honour thing. Yes, I'm a Republican. But yeah, there's a number of different things that haven't sort of triggered the issue as a major sort of.
Unlike they have in other places. Spain,
Yeah, well, obviously Spain has a completely different tradition and different history, partly. I mean, we are a member of the Alliance of European Republican Movements, and we have Spanish counterparts. We have counterparts in Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Spain. And what's fascinating is that all of the northern European countries, their experience is quite similar. Their monarchies have been around for a fair while. They're seen as fairly innocuous and powerless. Republican opinion is around the 20 to 25% as it is here. But Spain is very, very different. Not least because it's had the civil war with the Republicans on one side, and that all the language and ideology around that comes into the debate. And it's also very fragmented politically and also fragmented geographically. So the whole issue takes on a completely different meaning. And of course their king was, now a former king, was put on the throne by Franco, the fascist dictator, which also creates a whole another angle to it. So, but yeah, I mean they, when was it? Was it earlier this year, wasn't it, that the king stepped down? I mean, this is the weird language of royalty, is that the king decided he's abdicated in favour of his son. Well, what you could say on the headline is he's resigning under huge pressure. That's what you should say. He's quit under huge pressure. And unlike other people that quit under huge pressure, he just handed the job to his son without anyone caring. But when he did that, there were some polls that were saying 48% were in favour of getting rid of them. But yeah, whether they can organise themselves, there's a lot of interesting theory about how campaigns and movements actually succeed, and a lot of it is just people being able to organise themselves and mobilise around an issue. Yeah.
Do you think a democratic vote in this country would choose, I don't know if I can find it vote, but would choose to keep the monarchy, and if in some wonderful land this occurred, how would you feel if they in fact did choose to keep the monarchy? Would you respect the decision as a democratic choice, or would you continue to campaign this?
I would respect the decision, and I would continue to campaign. It's my right as citizens to have the view and to wish to achieve a particular outcome, and that's what I always do until it's done. You know, and we've seen the same thing in Scotland. You know, the independence people aren't going away; they haven't stopped believing in independence. I do think that, as with independence in Scotland, you know, at the moment it's somewhere around 20–25% are sympathetic to the idea of getting rid of the monarchy. I think that if there was a 6 to 12 month major public campaign that would have the same impact on public engagement that independence referendum in Scotland had, it would be a huge, momentous moment in our history. There was an enormous campaign, both sides arguing about whether or not we want to go republic. I think that opinion polling would shift quite decisively in our favour. Now, whether it shifts enough to win, I don't know, but I think that there's a very good chance. More of a chance, perhaps, with Scotland, because Scotland was trying to do something much more risky in terms of people's personal experience and personal lives. It's very difficult to say that we would lose the pound and lose Europe and lose this and lose that and lose the other by getting rid of the monarchy and electing someone instead. It's a very different argument. And one of the things that gives me confidence is partly the experience of watching what happened in Scotland, but also our own experience of doing debates and talks and so on. I've done a number of debates with 200 people in the room, where at the beginning they do a vote, at the end they do a vote, and more often than not, that vote moves in our favour during the course of an hour and a half, 2 hours of vote. Sometimes not enough to win it for us, but sometimes absolutely, yeah, we take a majority in the course. Because most people never really stop to think about it, they don't think it's a problem, but as you said, most people aren't particularly enamoured, don't really care, and they're open to persuasion. When you put some of these arguments to people, they suddenly think, well, yeah, fair enough. You know? So yeah, it's absolutely winnable. If it wasn't one, then we would just carry on until it wasn't. I might have a slightly different definition of a next generation than Alice Hammond might be 5 or 10 years.
Cool, so round of applause for
Maybe my apologies for leaving you waiting for an hour.
it's fine, they just had me trying to talk. It didn't work well, but once again, thank you for all of you for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Graham as well for coming along, despite the traffic. He's actually still pushing through.